Good morning and welcome to Don't Fall Behind, World-Class Asset Management for Smarter Public Works webinar. I'm glad you've joined us for this great discussion today. I have just a few housekeeping items first. All lines will be muted during today's discussion, so please submit your questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at any time during the session. The presenters will answer your questions live at the end. Today's session will be recorded and you will receive an email with a link to the recording. So let's go ahead and, there is one more thing. We have some related assets, some resources that you can access. Again, down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a widget that just says related resources, I believe. So you've got some good information in there. So feel free to take those links and assets as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Luke Anderson, strategic solutions consultant here at Brightly, will be our moderator today. Luke comes from a background in energy automation and HVAC controls and has been with Brightly Software about 10 years. After receiving his FMP in 2017, Luke is focused on both sides of the asset management world, day-to-day operations and long-term strategic capital planning. Luke's current role as strategic consultant allows him to consult with civic leaders, helping to establish clear and justified capital plans. Welcome, Luke. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Most importantly, thank you, Mary. Mary's going to provide us some absolutely killer insight today. I've had the pleasure of doing some run-throughs with this, and every time we talk about the topics today, I'm taking more and different notes, so I'm very excited. So focusing on asset management really in the world that we live in today, with natural disasters, with our economic downturns, with our workforce turnover, with everything we're dealing with. It's great strategies, some great topics. So I'm going to start by Mary. I'm going to give you a little introduction. So I'm going to read your little bio here. Mary brings significant experience managing federally funded grant programs across the United States as well as North Carolina. Most recently, here in state government, managing $20 million in community development block grants, infrastructure, and $1.7 billion in FEMA public assistance grants. She oversaw some COVID relief funds, as well as dual roles in both state and infrastructure program manager for the NC Office of Recovery and Resiliency. As well as a state operations lead for the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management. So more experience than I could even pronounce in one paragraph. So very excited to have you here. Can we start, Mary? I want to start pretty broad. I want, if you don't mind, give us a kind of just an overview of some of the challenges, maybe give an overview of what this idea of asset management is, and we'll kind of jump into kind of what we want to talk about today.
Sure, and thanks for the opportunity. I really enjoyed this topic. It's certainly very timely. We're headfirst into hurricane season, and having grown up in Memphis, Tennessee, which is on a fault line, the new Madrigal, and spent a lot of time in Oklahoma and other states, we know that with this hurricane season come straight line winds and flooding and rainfall, which is only increasing over time. But wherever you are in the United States, any disaster declaration starts out by states and counties and all of the municipalities, public works authorities, and other eligible applicants. The damage assessments, the damages to your facilities, to your infrastructure, down to pipes that are underground, or some local governments have a variety of assets, facilities, and I'm talking about a plethora, but public works, as we know, is really the heart. That's how I look at it, at least the heart of a community, because when public works facilities, public utilities reach the community in a way that works and is basically created or rehabilitated or rebuilt for true longevity, that we know that that's the number one factor that helps a community have trust in the stability and potential for economic growth. So it really does lean a lot on public works. So we're going to talk about really three things: disaster recovery funds, how your impacts, damage impacts for your facilities really make a difference for supplemental appropriations that go beyond FEMA, public assistance, which is, of course, the infrastructure funding, and how there are opportunities in advance to understand what your priorities are, whether it is critical infrastructure, as with public works, or buildings, roads. I mean, there's lots of different concepts of critical infrastructure, but whatever is locally owned and maintained with the right kind of insurance, oftentimes National Floodplain Insurance Program, the FEMA program that's sold by various insurance companies insofar as your community is a participant. Insurance, we know, is very important as well. And asset inventories can capture all of this, but it is the strategic asset management plans that define for federal agencies that have this disaster funding what it is that's needed, sometimes down to the zip code. And we'll get into that a little bit. So we're going to talk about those things today.
Perfect. Yeah, and actually, I think that's a good place to start right there. I want to do the poll in just a minute. But I want to ask you this first. You mentioned two things that I think I hear about all the time: the asset inventory, right? Mm-hmm. Knowing what we own, but also knowing data about what we own, right? I've got these things, and it's got these attributes. It's this old. It's used this way. But then you also talked about a actual strategic asset management plan. Can you talk just a little bit of the address on a little bit of the difference? I know we're going to talk more, but kind of what that means, kind of comparing the two.
I can, and we're going to talk about Mary's map, which was a very sad study in what it is that allows FEMA the ability to better understand where your facilities are located. Undergrounded facilities, not so easy, but we'll get to that in just a minute. Because I wasn't much of a data person. I'm not trained in parsing data or coding or particular types of data analysis. But what I know is that data proves cost benefits. And now I am a sort of hybrid grant, federal regulations, policy, but particularly local government data nerd when it comes to how to prove these things, because you have them in an asset plan that's based upon the inventories. You've already modeled, for example, aging, lifespans, and you can prioritize based upon your inventories generally what's a priority to you, because we are used to, as local governments, folks are used to making these decisions. All right, this is going to cost X. We don't have the financing for that. So what grants are we going to go for? And that's one of the things that we do in our work. And I suppose the most important thing is understanding that an asset management plan proves repair versus replace. And it does it more quickly and based upon facts from weather modeling, in addition to the modeling that's already done from an aging perspective, an aging infrastructure perspective, no matter what. Most people start with critical infrastructure when financial decisions have to be made. And inventories get you to a point, but it's the strategic, more comprehensive plan that allows for certain types of modeling to be done. If you're in an earthquake area, earthquakes, Richter 2 scenarios. Flooding is a problem everywhere now. And there are flood maps that are funded by state agencies. And, NOAA just last year it was announced that NOAA received $500 million internally. This is not going to be a competitive grant to really expand coastal and inland flooding models, which can then be used by local governments, counties, public works, or utility authorities to take their own systems and use those models. So it's a really good opportunity, because using real data has only been something that has been underway for larger local governments and state and federal and state agencies over the past 10 years. So now is the time to think about that, especially with funding availability to do these kinds of plans.
Perfect. All right, well, let's push this first poll out here. That should have appeared for everybody. So we've got a few options on there. One, we've kind of defined what a asset management plan is. Click A if you've already got one in place. Click B if you feel like you've got a good idea of what you own and at least a good idea of when you want to replace it, right? Just kind of a schedule. It's not very strategic. It's not integrating too much, but it's more than just having a list, and that's what C is just having a list, right? Maybe we have a list of our buildings. Maybe we have a list of parks, maybe some major assets that we own, but we don't have anything beyond that. And then D, hoping nobody's going to click D, but unfortunately there may be a few. D is we don't have anything at all. We don't have any infrastructure or assets in place, or processes in place. I'll give it a minute here.
I was going to say, there's a lot of local governments that don't. They
I know it's unfortunate.
Yeah, and one thing I'm going to put out there while folks are answering the question is, I think we all know local governments, state agencies, federal agencies are taxed, and it's just difficult. To get on top of asset inventories. But the nice thing is, again, we have funding available for that.
Perfect.
Or local governments do. Yeah.
Right. All right, we got about half the people here, so we'll push it out here. Keep moving. Okay, great. So about a third at the level of the plan, and about a third have the list. And then about a shared between the nothing and some sort of end of life replacement. So a good mix.
Yep.
Good. Now we will have another poll coming up, kind of about so if you guys want to start thinking about it, kind of why do you feel like you're in that stage of your journey? But I do want to we'll keep going a little bit more with Mary. I'm excited to hear about this next topic before we ask that. But I want to talk specifically when we think about hurricane season, and not just hurricane season. It's El Derecho season right now, isn't it? I mean, they're getting hit. It's all over the news. The entire Southeast. It hasn't made it up to my area in North Carolina too much. We're getting some rain, but places are getting pounded. There was softball-sized hail in Texas. So talk a little bit with this season of weather upon us. How does asset management specifically impact a local government resiliency, recovery funding? How does it help them put them in a good place to get some of that handled?
Okay, and again, I love this topic, and I really, really appreciate us doing this. So for local governments, as I've mentioned, all facility damages count. Essentially, at the end of the day, strategic asset management plans tell a
Can I jump in real quick? When you say all facility damages count, I grew up in HVAC, so when I hear that, I think about buildings. But you're talking about road width, playground equipment, fence. Anything owned by the government. What does that mean? Facility damages? Yeah, please.
I'm going to use the tornado as an example because we can all get a mental image of a tornado. We've seen them. Anything that is damaged that is owned by a local government or a public utility authority, underground, above ground, and a lot of times the underground lines don't show damage for a few days, but FEMA gives you some time to collect those damage assessments. The onus is on the local government. Initially, they're called initial damage assessments before what's called a joint state FEMA damage assessment to come in and do some verifications. The local governments work with their typically county, or if they're a sovereign tribal nation or territory, the emergency managers that they know within their region or their area to roll up those damage costs. And that could be, they're called FEMA public assistance categories of work. A and B are debris operations and emergency protective measures. And sometimes that's enough. Like in the state of North Carolina, the threshold now is right about $18 million for the governor to ask the president to have FEMA come to town and write grants, directed grants to local governments for roads, bridges, dams, levees, if they own them and maintain them, which, we have the high hazard dam program, but I'll digress on that one from FEMA. We have parks, locally owned parks, locally owned roads. Some states have county roads. In North Carolina, we don't have county owned roads. It's either state or local. And it expands into public buildings, volunteer fire departments, fire and police stations, town halls, historic buildings that are in use at the time of the disaster, landfall, whatever event it is. Some recent let's say, human adversarial events that occur. Now, it wasn't enough to get a disaster declaration, but some people went and shot up an electric substation in one of our counties. And, don't know, hopefully that's not going to happen more and more, but hope is not a plan when it comes to that kind of thing. So disaster facilities for damage assessments, Public Works is always the critical one. But that doesn't mean that flooded buildings or buildings that have come down from a tornado, schools, county schools, local schools, including those that are private, are eligible for FEMA public assistance. And all of those collective damages count. And all of those should be assessed as soon as possible. But again, local governments can run in kind of thin. So having the inventory and knowing values for repair for 20 or 30 more years, or find the funding to replace. Sometimes FEMA shows up and they have what's called 406 mitigation funding, which is immediate funding that, if eligible, cost reasonable, and is shown to be, going to take care of business for the long term, go ahead. FEMA will write that mitigation into your project and allocate those costs. Now, again, you've got to have requisite insurance in place, if applicable, and you've got to have maintenance records. So hopefully that helps a little bit about what is a facility.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. So, and then I didn't mean to digress you, so apologize.
No,
but from the recovery side standpoint, having that plan and going through that, how does having that plan, obviously it gives us a baseline of what condition it was in, how to value it. Talk a little bit kind of how the asset management plan ties with that, please. Yeah. Right.
So local governments, are working hard. And for example, the EPA provides money to states to do asset inventories. That's great. The Department of Transportation and EPA are two federal agencies that have both shown that to have an asset management plan in place proves, in advance of a disaster, or right now in disaster season, anytime that you decide you're going to put an asset inventory together, you can take it further, like the Federal Highway Administration did and the EPA has done, to show the cost benefit that FEMA is going to come to town and assess for any permanent work, or I call physical facilities, anything that's plottable on a map. They're going to look at all of the permanent work damages and say, okay, so, and I have a client that I love working with, but there's a lot of aerial lines with public works facilities around the United States. And if there's straight line winds and trees come down on those aerial lines, then what do we do? So FEMA Public Assistance takes what was damaged and are mandated to take it back insofar as it's insured. And I won't keep repeating that, but maintained and insured as if it should be, if it's required to have insurance. They're supposed to take it back to the way it was the day before the disaster happened. But the 406 mitigation adder provided by FEMA, I call it adder funding, it can underground those lines. Why? Because FEMA doesn't want to keep coming back over and over and over, knowing that we've got increased amounts of rainfall, longer disaster or weather events, and stronger weather events. So FEMA knows, and subsequent annual competitive funds are intended for resiliency. And so they will underground those lines, can't go beyond a certain number related to the initial damage assessment. And then you get more in depth after the FEMA state joint assessments that are done for your state or tribal nation or territory. But those 406 mitigation adder funds can really add up. And next thing you know, you're undergrounding the lines and you have to worry about them again outside of the maintenance.
Interesting. So from a again, thinking, I'm going to kind of compare the asset inventory to the strategic asset management plan. If I have an inventory, and let's say something simple like a roof, right? Yep. A roof gets destroyed during the tornado. If I can show, if we show FEMA that roof was 25 years old, there are FEMA's, without any other data, FEMA's going to say, well, a roof is supposed to last about 30 years or 25 years. So they're going to give us some sort of value of that age of that roof.
They're going to look at the cost to repair it, right? And also they include
the day before, right?
That's right.
Based on the condition the day before. Now I have a plan in place. That plan includes operations, it includes maintenance, it includes data, and it can show that actually we put a new rubber coating. We actually refurbished that roof last year. Even though it's 25 years old, it was actually in very good condition. Does that change what happens with FEMA and how they look at the value of that roof?
Whatever is in place the day before the disaster is what FEMA is going to repair, provided that it's got everything, maintained, et cetera. But that's what FEMA repairs. And so, for example, let's say you've got the great roof, but the windows, you're on a coast or you're in the mountains and winds are a problem. Does it make sense from a cost benefit analysis on the coast, for example, for FEMA to fund hurricane shutters for your business? That happens. Do you get the really fancy, extremely nice, expensive hurricane shutters? No, but you do get the ones that meet certain codes and standards. And that's happened all along both coasts and in the mountains, Colorado, or, the Rockies, and out here, the Smokies.
And so that's part of resiliency, I would imagine.
It is part of long-term resiliency. And then in addition to that, and then there's those, and those are funds that are law, right? So we have the Stafford Act. Won't bore everybody with that one. But the Stafford Act is what allows FEMA to come to town if we have exceeded, again, in North Carolina, the statewide damage assessment threshold of $18 million. For the record, that damage assessment threshold is your 2020 census times $1.77. So North Carolina is about 18 million. And then each county has to hit their threshold. I've had conversations with a variety of different people in various areas of the United States. And sometimes we don't get our damages collected. And that's where those asset plans come in place for more quicker initial damage inspections as well, damage assessments as well for costs, which makes it a lot easier to roll up the chain as every state, territory, and tribal nation has in place from an emergency management perspective. So those asset plans know in advance conditions, maintenance records, et cetera, but it is the asset plans that have prioritized the projects that FEMA should go to first. That should be assessed first, where the project should be written first. And it may be that you already have the mitigation in mind. FEMA has to agree. Is it cost reasonable? Is it necessary? And will it provide long-term mitigative benefits? So that's that extra mile that an asset plan does.
Interesting. So, and I think there's a lot more to the benefits of having an asset management plan, a strategic asset management plan, but there's probably one we can kind of hang your hat on, that if there is an instance of a FEMA interaction being needed to be done, having an asset management plan it's going to pay for itself with the potential of the money you can get. Because everything you just mentioned isn't happening if FEMA walks in and there's no data, right? You're not.
It makes it a lengthier process. People are trying to drive, so they've cut and shoved debris to the side of the road, and within a certain amount of time, it's expected, say 30 days, that you have your damages captured, your initial local damage assessments done. But how many local governments have the staff to do that? How many local governments know how to assess X cubic yards of vegetative debris, for example, and where to take it? Is it properly permitted? So from a damage assessment perspective, to keep it simple is the best thing. And you do that by referencing your list, which gets us to Mary's map at some point. Again, very sad.
That's where I was going to go. Yeah.
Yeah, very sad. And in advance of, or, outside of thinking about disaster recovery, storms, man-made events, et cetera, we had that D+ rating for our infrastructure around the nation, territories. And the goal was, before COVID, and still is, to get that to perhaps a B. That's a long game. And I think that the mindsets at local governments, or at least it's been my experience and the experience of a lot of colleagues, that local governments are starting to understand patchwork doesn't work. It doesn't create confidence with communities. And there are ways to define at least a plan. It may be a 30-year plan or a 50-year plan. A lot of plans that are in place presently that I've reviewed for cities around the United States and some of the Canadian provinces show 100 years, but you have a plan in place as opposed to, well, what do we need to do in 3 months? Or, oh my gosh, we just had a tornado and I'm not really sure what can be done. So the onus is then on FEMA to make all of those decisions for you, which that's what they do. And FEMA people have been very helpful to a lot of us who now have this career in disaster recovery and grants. That being said, there is a shift, knowing how taxed agencies are, federal, state, and local government. There is a shift to taking more ownership of your assets, understanding more about what you have and what you need, what you can finance, and what you're going to need funding for, whether it's a grant or a low interest long-term loan like an SRF loan.
So you've mentioned Mary's Map a few times. Can we dig into it? Can we hear the story? Can you tell us about it?
We sure can. So back before Hurricane Matthew in, I think, October of 2016, it gets a little foggy. For the record, we've had 9 federal disaster declarations since Matthew, not including COVID, in North Carolina. And usually we walk around our days and we don't think about disasters, multiple overlapping repetitive disasters. Then all of a sudden an infectious disease event shows up. So it's a lot, but there are people that are minding the store when it comes to these overlapping disasters. Local governments for a very long time didn't have an idea about what their inventories were. And when I say inventories, I mean everything from actually like the public works shed that's way out in the lower 40, or for example, extremely expensive emergency rescue equipment, low flow pumps that were out on loan to another local government that wasn't tracked. And so a disaster hits and all of a sudden it's extremely stressful and you don't know where your stuff is, for lack of a better term. That's just the simplest way I can put it. So early 2016, I believe, FEMA trained states on their software called FEMA Grants Portal. And FEMA Grants Portal is a online portal for every local government, and I'm sure the majority of people on this call understand what it is. But back then, FEMA Grants Portal was training states, and I went out with a colleague all over North Carolina. Lots of folks showed up to these trainings because finally we were going to go from written project worksheets to online, fully transparent. Here's what FEMA thinks you should get. Yes or no to the 406 mitigation adder. Here's your insurance. And local governments go in and regularly update their insurance records. And all of the other items, maintenance records, et cetera. You can do that anytime, day or night, 24/7, 365. But before we had FEMA Grants Portal, when I would go to local governments with a colleague, there were folks that didn't have that list of facility assets. And FEMA pays for a lot of things. Like FEMA will pay if records are destroyed. And if there's anything on, they'll digitize records, paper records that are kept in boxes. And so of course there's been that shift about data, being available online in a way that provides the quicker facts that justify repair to your infrastructure after a disaster. Mary's Map was local governments going to MapQuest or Google and printing off their jurisdictional, doing a screenshot in quadrants of their jurisdiction, and sometimes it was 16 screenshots to make up their larger jurisdiction, and putting X's where there was critical infrastructure and O's where there was less critical infrastructure, according to the roads, and to help FEMA get there, and for future damage assessments, if people that you don't know show up, to help you to come up with the damages for your actual permanent work or your physical facilities. So that was Mary's map. And it was helpful to jog memories before Matthew, because when Matthew made landfall, there were local governments that said they pulled out that map and were able to sit down and say, okay, here's our critical facilities. And then projects were written more expediently. But the data that is collected now based upon asset inventories and strategic plans, insofar as they model storm events, you've already got far more information than simply the location of your infrastructure, right? So the inventories have age, condition, maintenance records, but the asset plans with modeling, population modeling, weather modeling, various types of weather modeling that's already available to us. You can see what your financial position is. You will know quite rather quickly what it is that FEMA is going to fund. And then we talk about those supplemental appropriations that also have to be proven. And in my mind, it is the local government, the regional public authority, utility authority, that helps set the standard and provides clarity relating to who deserves those supplemental appropriations. State funding. If a state has disaster recovery reserve funding, technically that's supposed to come in pretty quickly and assist with housing and certain types of critical infrastructure. But essentially, there's funds that's supposed to back cleanup after FEMA leaves, including the HUD CDBG-DR program. Depending upon the congressional appropriation, it takes Congress sometimes a long time. Imagine if Congress got that data, states and Congress got the data more quickly. It may take less time to understand infrastructure needs, and because they have to be the most impacted and distressed communities that are getting that third tranche of disaster recovery funding, essentially to back cleanup for what FEMA doesn't take care of.
Well, there was a question that came in. I was going to save it, but it's pretty well related to what you just mentioned about the inventory. The city reports buildings, parks, and vehicles with the NC League of Municipalities for the liability insurance. Mm-hmm. So the items are listed. Do you suggest a more in-house type of inventory or kind of strategic asset management plan? They're trying to account for everything, but it's taking a long time.
So I'll use an example of the Federal Highway Administration. The Federal Highway Administration and the EPA have both implemented inventories using modeling, flood modeling, depending upon what's most prevalent in your area or most likely in your area, knowing that we're watching the trends increase on severity, length of storms, and tertiary, benefits, or tertiary impacts rather. They see quite clearly that what they have insurance for, required to have insurance for, and what they're modeling and what they're capturing is best held at the local level insofar as that state has jurisdiction of those highways. So in my opinion, with the League of Municipalities and the insurance, it's always a good idea to make sure that what you can do, what you can afford to do, because there are local governments that can't afford NFIP insurance. But if you are in the fortunate position where you are able to assess your own insurance needs based upon the regulations for disaster recovery, say, with the NFIP requirement, if flooding, that flood insurance is required, I would advise that you at least review your local independent insurance needs. Outside of, I think what we're saying is that the League of Municipalities provides insurance coverage if the person who asked the question wants to clarify that. And that's great. As long as the insurance coverage meets the regulatory standards, then great. But if you have, say, a need for additional insurance on additional facilities that the league may not manage, I would consider exploring that. And always glad to have that discussion at another webinar, because there's a interesting topic about flood insurance and asset management as well.
And the only thing I think is important is buildings, parks, vehicles, especially buildings, identifying if there are critical pieces of those buildings. So we may have City Hall. It might be worth it to break out and know what the age and condition, maybe the roof is, maybe the boiler and the chiller, things that like Mary keeps talking about criticality. If we wake up Monday morning and it's broken, if that's a big deal, we probably want to keep an eye on it.
And something that people don't think about is parking lots. So
Absolutely.
You got the town hall, you've got the courthouse, or the school. Well, the parking lot. Oftentimes parking lots will sit there for a long time, and parking lots can get badly damaged. And when parking lots get damaged, or underground infrastructure pipes, become inundated with silt and burst, come apart at the seams, as it were. Parking lots sink in. You start getting continual sinkholes. That's the kind of thing where it may not show up for a while, but when you're doing your damage assessments, always think about what's under your parking lots. So not critical, but can be really dangerous.
Well, and expensive if you let them go without taking the cheap patching and overlaying. Then all of a sudden you're reconstructing a parking lot, and where are you going to put all those cars?
Exactly. And it's, FEMA also wants to see us use nature-based solutions, so we stop pouring concrete everywhere for continued water runoff downhill. But when you do your asset inventories, think about those things. Some people may think furniture needs, and yeah, furniture, FEMA replaces furniture. I mean, they're not going to mitigate your, uncomfortable chair to a lazy boy, but according to what is necessary for your parking lot or anything else, they'll pay to replace it. And if cost effective and eligible, that parking lot also gets the consideration for real resiliency over the long haul.
Absolutely. So I'd like to actually show an example, Mary, of a model that was done. It doesn't include weather, but I think it's a good example where weather could actually be included. And I think it would be a neat to show the group, and then have you kind of talk about what it would mean to include something like flooding and flood mapping in this example, because it's a city that's right on the water. So I think it'll be a good example.
Right.
So it won't be very long, but let's see if this will start up here.
The weather modeling is something that I think is extremely interesting, and again, not always affordable, but we'll
Absolutely. Get there. So this is a city on a lake, and essentially the main road here that you see up here, it's all in fairly acceptable condition now. But what we're going to be doing now is we're modeling the life cycle of this. This is a stormwater infrastructure, and this is where I want to focus, is right on the connection there with the water, because it doesn't take very long for those assets, not just other assets, but specifically along that ridge, to start to deteriorate and essentially reach a point where, we're 15, 17 years from now, 16 years from now, we're so far behind in deferred maintenance and backlog of projects. This is where I think a weather model would come in, because my guess is that with the rise in this lake or any kind of change in weather pattern, these assets may not even last 16 years.
Right.
And essentially, this model is currently based on a very low budget, and that's one of the challenges. Yeah, go ahead.
And no, I'd like to say I appreciate the simplicity of this model showing this, because I've seen some with universities that have done this, or with large cities that have done this kind of modeling for all kinds of weather events that are so complicated to look at. It's not always the easiest thing to translate. So what you're showing here is exactly, what is the annualization of this? So you're starting with a little bit of red, and then we're rolling into a whole lot of red. And what is the annualization for this? Is it a 10-year thing, or how?
This means, I can pull it up here. I'll zoom in a little bit. Oh, I can't move down. Oh, it's a little hard to see. It's over a 40-year period, and this gives you a breakdown here of how many assets you have within that certain level. So you can see where that red is starting to really show up about year 15.
Right. And I see that you've got rehabilitate and repair. Of course, if, yeah, and I mean, the replacement option is always something that local governments everywhere are thinking about because of the aged infrastructure, that D+ we've got.
Right. Well, and this is the approach when we keep our current budget, which is severely underfunded.
Right.
Which is the other big problem. And the other big thing with the management plan, an asset management plan is how do we identify, hey, what is the actual budget? How much should we be spending? And look at the difference. If we increase it to 625, look how much more capacity work we're doing in that first 10, 15 years.
Right. And we can overlap various types of disasters in this modeling. There are grant funds available to do the asset inventories. EPA requires it. DOT has certain requirements for asset inventories being taken. But there's a lot of other infrastructure that doesn't have an obvious funding source for asset inventory. And that's where we talk about those competitive annual grants that are made available. There's capacity and capability or planning grants that don't require cost benefit analyses, as a lot of people are aware of in grant applications, which can be very daunting for local governments. But they're, one of the things I enjoy doing is writing those grant applications. Construction grant applications almost always require a benefit cost analysis. FEMA is rethinking that because we know that there's a lot of local governments that can't hire somebody to do a cost benefit analysis. Mm-hmm. But the capability or capacity building portion of it can fund an asset inventory for your local infrastructure. And FEMA wants us to better understand what we need to do so they don't keep showing up over and over and over for the same kind of atmospheric events.
That's right. That's right. Well, good. Well, very quick shout out to Mr. Rod Lovely. If you ever get a chance to work with him, he's brilliant.
He is.
He made these models. So, but good. So let me pull this back. So let's, I did have two kind of final questions, a little bit more in wrapping, but I know there's a lot you've picked up over your experience at the federal and local level. So, I never liked the what tip do you like? So I always like to frame it this way. Knowing what you know now, if you could go back to the very beginning and give a piece of advice to somebody that's at the very start with all that knowledge, what would that piece of advice be?
So I'm going to say that, I wasn't thinking about data at the very beginning. That's been a trend since I, really started, getting much more involved in this industry, if you will, if disaster recovery can be considered an industry. One of the things that I would most advise is I'm going to go back to those damage assessments. I'm going to go back to that strategic plan. You know where your infrastructure is, whether it's X's and O's on a printed off quadrant map for your jurisdiction. Translate that into an asset inventory. On top of that, damage assessments. Refer to that asset inventory for those damage assessments. Do your prioritizations because, like I said earlier, the decisions that are made federally for supplemental recovery funds are, in North Carolina, 50 counties were included in Matthew. And the same counties were impacted for Florence 2 years later. Other local governments in states around the United States and the territories and the sovereign tribal nations are experiencing different kinds of overlapping infrastructure, damaging weather events. So the big thing for me is locally, down to the zip code, coming together and providing those local damage assessments up the chain to your emergency managers, knowing your emergency managers is very important. You've got some days to do it, but some damages underground don't show up for a few days. And you'll be prepared when FEMA and the state, who are managing the FEMA funds, show up to do the joint damage assessments and justify or validate what you've done, provided you can get to it, right? And that's sometimes a stretch for local staff. But most importantly, Those damage assessments inform other agencies, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, EPA, USDA, the Department of Commerce, the Economic Development Administration, what supplemental disaster recovery funding is needed, how much is needed, and where it's needed. And yes, the state and feds make a lot of those decisions for us, but strategic asset plans that involve future conditions, including weather modeling and population growth, for example, or loss, help the agencies that make the decisions understand, are we the most distressed? Are we, have we been devastated and incredibly impacted? Because I believe that it's those damage assessments that really inform early on what's needed and where. And so that's the advice.
So I'm going to open it up to Q&A. We've had a few questions come in, so if any other questions do come in, I'll kind of ask them as they type them up. But relating to kind of what you just said, who pays for that? Who funds asset management plans and funds these processes of building these things?
Okay.
I'm sure it's a little bit of everything, right?
Right. And there are, so we have EPA grants. I've mentioned EPA grants. Now, of course, that's for your water and sewer and wastewater infrastructure. Those are that takes you to asset inventories. Okay. There are some states have asset management plan directed appropriations for their local governments. Not everybody, but it's headed in that direction. The FEMA BRIC funding, and you'll want to talk to your hazard mitigation grant state contact prepared. GIS modeling, if it can be justified, and FEMA's the ones going and recommending that we have these scenarios available for these plans. So we can plan right now or very soon, knowing it's going to take a long time to get there. You have economic development grants, EDA, when you're thinking about economic development, whether it's planning or what you need to do related to population growth or loss, industrial growth or loss, businesses, et cetera. So what I'll do is provide a listing of grants, because I do have that list. And what I'll do is, for those that have attended, I'll just get the emails, and I will send out a listing of grant funding opportunities. You can also take those damages that you come up with and combine them into documentation data that tell that nonfiction story for your states to consider. What is it you need to do so you better understand, okay, here's our aged infrastructure, here's how much we're spending on upkeep and maintenance, and we're going to be doing patchwork for the next 20 years. To get from a D+ to a B, we need X. First, right, to start with the asset inventory, the strategic asset management plan, and then the project prioritization. And oftentimes federal grants require community buy-in. And there are grants available to engage communities. So you're not doing things in a way that makes your citizens wary of decision-making. I've seen those community meetings really, really garner trust. And it's a total shift from meetings that can kind of become contentious, particularly around public works. Yeah, so good. There's a lot of grant availability.
And then final question, then we'll have our final poll here at the very end. But final question, and I'll kind of summarize it here. How do we convey this to leadership, councils, boards, people that control the purse strings? How do we convey this message? Because it doesn't always seem to land right to the people at the top.
So when I just mentioned community, your citizen buy-in. So a lot of times public works is a mystery. So I'm going to use public works as an example. To me, public works is a mystery. How does a lot of this work? I mean, I understand that there are valves and pump stations and things that move water to my house and collect, wastewater and move it out of my house. But we've done a lot of things because we've had no money or very little money historically. I remember $100,000 in a grant was a big deal, 10 years ago. And now we've had hundreds of billions of dollars in money from COVID, and in fact, before COVID, the D plus to the B, right, dropped on states and local governments to use for a variety of different ways. Community engagement is a really critical factor. That gets you to trust. When your communities trust you, then you have buy-in. And when your councils and commissioners receive the phone calls instead of, why is my utility bill going up? Because remember, there's local governments operating with tax revenues that are kind of based on the 1980s and not to what we need today to get the work done. So to convince councils, commissioners, representatives that asset, inventory and asset management plans in particular save in the long term, make sure you've got the community engagement outside of the most basic things that may go out in the mail. Make sure you have public meetings, invite those folks and have the conversation. I'm always glad to provide what helps make that conversation easier and more influential, but it's a matter of all-encompassing community engagement with the councils and commissioners on board at a certain point in time, provided they're interested. Hopefully they are. And that is what allows local government leaders to make decisions about, all right, do we patch that over there? Do we replace this culvert right now? Do we do X project that we know we need to do, but we don't, and say, all right, so now it's worth it to do a strategic asset management plan based upon our inventory.
Perfect.
It takes time, but it also takes trust.
Well, good. Well, thank you. I'm going to push this last poll out to the audience. If anybody does want any more information or needs specific help, please click there. Otherwise, Mary, thank you so much. Really learned a lot. I appreciate it, and I'll just leave that poll up for everybody if you do have a need for right now. Well, good. If you don't mind, Tracy, you can wrap us up, and we'll call it a day. We did pretty good on time.
Yeah, great job and great discussion. Thank you both very much. And thank everyone who joined us today. I hope you got a lot out of this discussion. Please do submit information into the poll. That'll help us understand what we should present on our next webinar. So terrific information that you can provide for us. For any questions that we didn't get to, we will definitely answer those through email. You will get a recording of this presentation in an email within 24 hours of this presentation. Thank you so much again for joining us, and we hope that you'll join us again next time. Have a great day.
Brightly,